Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Chapter 101. The Decanter. Before the English ship disappears from view, let's note that it was from London and named after the late Samuel Enderby, a merchant from that city, who was the original owner of the well-known whaling company Enderby and Sons. In my humble opinion, this company is not far behind the royal houses of the Tudors and Bourbons in terms of historical significance. My records don't clarify how long this great whaling house had been around before the year 1775, but that year marked the launch of the first English ships that regularly hunted the sperm whale. Prior to that, for about 20 years, since 1726, brave whalers from Nantucket and the Vineyard had pursued this great creature, but only in the North and South Atlantic. They didn't venture elsewhere. It should be noted that the Nantucketers were the first to harpoon the sperm whale using civilized steel, and for 50 years, they were the only ones in the world to do so. In 1778, a fine ship named the Amelia, outfitted specifically for whaling and funded entirely by the energetic Enderby family, boldly rounded Cape Horn and became the first ship from any nation to launch a whaleboat in the Great South Sea. The voyage was skillful and fortunate, and upon returning with a hold full of valuable sperm, the Amelia inspired other English and American ships to follow suit, thus opening up the vast sperm whale grounds of the Pacific. Not satisfied with this achievement, the hard-working Enderby family managed to persuade the British government to send the sloop of war Rattler on a whaling expedition in the South Sea. Commanded by a naval post captain, the Rattler had a successful journey, but the details of its contributions are unclear. In 1819, the same company outfitted its own whaling ship for a pioneering expedition to the remote waters of Japan. This ship, aptly named the Siren, conducted a notable exploratory cruise, leading to the general awareness of the great Japanese whaling grounds. The Siren was commanded by a Captain Coffin from Nantucket. All praise to the Enderby family, whose company I believe still exists today, even though the original Samuel must have long ago passed on to the great beyond. The ship named after him was truly deserving of the honor. She was a fast, noble vessel in every way. I boarded her once at midnight off the Patagonian coast and enjoyed a hearty drink in the forecastle. We had a great time, and everyone on board was a good sport. A short life to them, and a jolly death. That wonderful evening reminds me of the warm, hearty hospitality of that ship, and I hope I never forget it. Did I mention we had flip? Yes, we drank it at the rate of 10 gallons an hour. When a squall hit, it gets quite stormy off the coast of Patagonia. Everyone, guests included, was called to reef the topsails. We were so tipsy that we had to pull each other up using bowlines, and we foolishly got our jacket hems caught in the sails, leaving us dangling there, reefed tight in the howling wind, a warning example to all drunken sailors. Fortunately, the masts stayed upright, and eventually, we climbed down so sober that we had to pass the flip around again, though the salty spray rushing into the forecastle had somewhat ruined it for me. The beef was excellent, tough but flavorful. They claimed it was bull beef. Others said it was from a dromedary, but I can't say for sure. They had dumplings, too, small but hearty, round and almost indestructible. I thought you could actually feel them rolling around in your stomach after you swallowed them. If you leaned too far forward, you risked losing them like billiard balls. The bread? Well, it was what it was, and at least it was good for preventing scurvy. It was the only fresh food they had. The forecastle wasn't very well lit, so it was easy to slip into a dark corner while eating it. But overall, from bow to stern, considering the cook's pots and his own impressive cooking skills, I'd say the Samuel Enderby was a lively ship with plenty of good food and drink, great flip, strong crew, and excellent from top to bottom. But why was it, I wonder, that the Samuel Enderby and some other English whalers I know of, not all of them, were such famous, hospitable ships? They passed around beef, bread, and jokes, never seeming to tire of eating, drinking, and laughing. I can tell you. The plentiful good cheer among these English whalers deserves a historical examination, and I have thoroughly researched the history of whaling when necessary. The English were preceded in the whaling industry by the Dutch, Zealanders, and Danes, from whom they borrowed many terms still used today, as well as their old customs of abundance in food and drink. Generally speaking, English merchant ships tend to skimp on their crew's rations, but not so with English whalers. Thus, this tradition of good cheer aboard whaling ships is not the norm for the English, but rather an exception with a specific origin, which I am about to explain. During my research into whale history, I came across an old Dutch book that smelled like whalers. The title was Dan Koopman, which led me to believe it was the valuable memoirs of some Amsterdam cooper in the whaling industry, since every whaling ship needs a cooper. My theory was supported by the fact that it was written by someone named Fitz Swackhammer. But my friend Dr. Snodhead, a learned man and professor of Low Dutch and High German at Santa Claus and St. Pot's College, who I gave a box of sperm candles for his help, soon informed me that Dan Koopman didn't mean the cooper, but the merchant. This ancient Dutch book covered the commerce of Holland, including an interesting section on its whaling industry. In the chapter titled Smear, or Fat, I found an extensive list of supplies for the pantries and cellars of 180 Dutch whaling ships. Here's a translation of part of that list, courtesy of Dr. Snodhead. 400,000 pounds of beef, 60,000 pounds of Friesland pork, 150,000 pounds of stockfish, 550,000 pounds of biscuits, 72,000 pounds of soft bread, 2,800 firkins of butter, 20,000 pounds of Texel and Leyden cheese, 144,000 pounds of cheese, probably of lesser quality, 550 anchors of Geneva, 10,800 barrels of beer. Most statistical tables are dry and boring, but this one is different, overflowing with measures of good gin and cheer. I spent 3 days digesting all this beer, beef, and bread, during which many profound thoughts came to me that could be applied to the larger questions of existence. I also compiled my own estimates of the amount of stockfish consumed by each Low Dutch harpooner in the ancient Greenland and Spitsbergen whaling industries. First, the quantity of butter and Texel and Leyden cheese is astounding. I attribute this to their naturally rich natures, made even richer by their work, particularly given that they hunted in the cold polar seas, right off the coasts of the Eskimo country, where the local people drink train oil as a social drink. The amount of beer is also quite large, 10,800 barrels. Since those polar fisheries could only be pursued during the short summer, the whole expedition for a Dutch whaler, including the voyage to and from the Spitsbergen Sea, didn't last much longer than 3 months, say, with about 30 men on each of their 180 ships, meaning there were around 400 Low Dutch seamen in total. Therefore, I estimate that there were precisely 2 barrels of beer per man for a 12-week period, not counting his share of the 550 anchors of gin. Now, whether these gin and beer-drinking harpooneers, who you might expect to be drunk, were really the right kind of people to stand in the bow of a boat and accurately aim at flying whales is questionable. Yet they did aim, and they did hit. But remember, this was very far north, where beer is good for the constitution. Down near the equator in our southern fisheries, beer might make the harpooner sleepy at the masthead and tipsy in his boat, which could lead to significant losses for Nantucket and New Bedford. But enough of that. It's clear that the old Dutch whalers of 2 or 3 centuries ago enjoyed a good life, and the English whalers have not overlooked this fine example. They say that when cruising in an empty ship, if you can't get anything better out of the world, at least you can enjoy a good meal. And with that, let's drink. Chapter 102, A Bower in the Arsacides. Until now, I have mostly focused on the incredible features of the sperm whale's exterior and a few of its internal structures. However, to fully understand this creature, I need to delve deeper and reveal its complete skeleton. But wait, Ishmael, how can you, just a rower in the fishery, claim to know anything about the inner workings of the whale? Did Stubb give lectures on whale anatomy while standing on your capstan, holding up a rib for everyone to see? Explain yourself, Ishmael. Can you bring a full-grown whale onto your deck for examination like a cook serving a roast pig? Certainly not. You've been a reliable witness, but be careful not to take on the unique privilege of Jonah, talking about the bones, joints, and all the insides of the Leviathan. I admit that since Jonah, not many whalemen have explored the depths of the adult whale's anatomy. Still, I had the chance to examine a smaller whale up close. On one ship I was on, a young sperm whale was brought on board to use its blubber for making sheaths for harpoon barbs and lance heads. You bet I seized that opportunity to break out my hatchet and knife and see what was inside that little cub. As for my knowledge of the bones of a fully grown whale, I owe it to my late royal friend, Tranquo, the king of Trank, one of the Arsacides. Years ago, while on the trading ship Day of Algiers, I was invited to spend part of the Arsacidean holidays with King Tranquo at his seaside villa in Pupella, not far from what sailors called Bamboo Town, his capital. King Tranquo, who had a great appreciation for unique treasures, gathered rare items from his people, including intricately carved wood, beautifully crafted shells, inlaid spears, luxurious paddles, aromatic canoes, and natural wonders washed up on his shores. Among these wonders was the skeleton of a large sperm whale that had washed ashore after a fierce storm, its head resting against a coconut tree, its leafy branches resembling its jet-black spout. After the whale was stripped of its deep layers and its bones dried in the sun, the skeleton was transported to the Pupella Glen, where a grand temple of palm trees now sheltered it. The ribs displayed trophies. The vertebrae were engraved with Arsacidean stories in strange symbols, and the skull held a perpetual flame, making it seem like the whale was still spouting water, while its massive jaw hung from a branch like the fabled sword that terrified Damocles. It was an astonishing sight. The wood was as green as moss, the tall trees stood proudly, full of life, and the earth beneath resembled a weaver's loom, covered in a vibrant carpet made from intertwining vines and blooming flowers. All the trees with their heavy branches, the shrubs, ferns, and grasses, and the lively air were constantly in motion. Through the leaves, the sun seemed to weave the unending greenery. Oh, busy weaver, unseen weaver. Pause. One question. Where does your fabric lead? What palace will it adorn? Why all this endless toil? Speak, weaver. Stop your hand. Just one word. But the shuttle continues to fly, and the patterns emerge from the loom. The ever-flowing carpet keeps moving. The weaver god weaves, and in his crafting he is deafened to mortal voices. And with that humming, we, the onlookers, are also deafened. Only when we escape will we hear the multitude of voices it carries. So it is in all factories. The words spoken amidst the noise of the spinning wheels are unheard inside, but outside the walls, they burst forth through open windows. That's how wrongdoings have been revealed. Ah, mortal, be cautious, for in the clamor of the world's great loom, your most subtle thoughts may be overheard from afar. Amidst the vibrant, life-filled loom of that Arsacidean forest, the massive white skeleton lay relaxed, a giant sloth. Yet as the green threads of life intertwined around him, the mighty sloth appeared to be the clever weaver. He himself was covered in vines, growing greener and livelier each month, but he remained just a skeleton. Life enveloped death. Death intertwined with life. The grim god mingled with youthful life and created curly-headed wonders. When I visited this magnificent whale with King Tranquo and saw the skull as an altar with smoke rising from where real jet once flowed, I was surprised that the king viewed a chapel as a valuable artifact. He laughed, but I was even more surprised that the priests insisted that the smoky jet was real. I walked back and forth in front of the skeleton, brushed aside vines, and pushed through the ribs. Using a ball of twine, I wandered through the many winding paths and shaded alcoves. But soon my line was spent. Following it back, I exited where I entered. There was nothing alive inside, just bones. After cutting a green measuring stick, I ventured back into the skeleton. From their narrow slit in the skull, the priest spotted me measuring the last rib. "How dare you measure our god?" they shouted. "That's our job!" "All right, priests, how long do you say he is?" A fierce debate broke out among them over feet and inches. They hit each other with their measuring sticks, making the skull echo. Taking advantage of the chaos, I quickly finished my own measurements. I plan to share these measurements with you now. However, I must note that I can't just make up any measurements I want. There are reliable sources you can refer to for verification. There's a Leviathan Museum in Hull, England, one of the country's whaling ports, where they have fine specimens of finbacks and other whales. I've also heard that the museum in Manchester, New Hampshire, claims to have the only perfect specimen of a Greenland or river whale in the United States. Additionally, in Yorkshire, England, Sir Clifford Constable owns the skeleton of a sperm whale, though it's smaller and not as large as my friend King Tranquo's. In both cases, the stranded whales belong to their owners based on similar claims. King Tranquo took his because he wanted it, and Sir Clifford because he owned the land where it was found. Sir Clifford's whale has been fully assembled, so you can open and close all its bony parts, spread its ribs like a giant fan, and swing from its lower jaw all day. Some trapdoors will be locked, and a footman will guide visitors with a bunch of keys. Sir Clifford is considering charging 2 pence for a peek into the whispering gallery of the spine, 3 pence to hear the echo in the hollow of its brain, and 6 pence for an unrivaled view from its forehead. The dimensions I'll share with you now are directly from my right arm, where I had them tattooed, as that was the only secure way to preserve such important information during my wild travels. However, since I was short on space and wanted the rest of my body to be blank for a poem I was composing, at least the parts that weren't tattooed, I didn't include the odd inches. In fact, inches won't even be necessary for a proper measurement of the whale. Chapter 103. Measurement of the whale's skeleton. First, I want to present a clear statement about the living size of the Leviathan whose skeleton we're going to examine. This information might be useful. Based on a careful calculation I made, which partly relies on Captain Scoresby's estimate of 70 tons for the largest Greenland whale at 60 feet long, I've determined that a fully grown sperm whale, measuring between 85 and 90 feet in length and just under 40 feet in circumference, would weigh at least 90 tons. This means, assuming there are 13 men per ton, it would outweigh the entire population of a village with 1,100 residents. Don't you think that brains, like a team of oxen, should be applied to this Leviathan to help a landsman even begin to imagine it? Having already described its skull, spout hole, jaw, teeth, tail, forehead, fins, and various other parts, I will now highlight the most interesting aspects of the overall structure of its exposed bones. Since the massive skull makes up a significant portion of the entire skeleton and is the most complex part, and since we won't revisit it in this chapter, you should keep it in mind as we move forward. Otherwise, you won't get a full understanding of the structure we're about to look at. In length, the sperm whale's skeleton at Tranque measured 72 feet, which means that when fully fleshed out, it must have reached 90 feet long, because a whale's skeleton loses about 1/5 of its length compared to its living body. Of those 72 feet, the skull and jaw made up about 20 feet, leaving approximately 50 feet of backbone. Attached to this backbone, for a little less than a third of its length, was the massive circular rib cage that once protected its vital organs. To me, this enormous chest, with its long, straight spine extending away from it, looked a lot like the hull of a large ship that is just being built, with only some 20 of its bare bow ribs inserted, while the keel remains a long, disconnected beam for the time being. There were 10 ribs on each side. Starting from the neck, the first rib was nearly 6 feet long. The second, third, and fourth were each longer than the last until you reached the fifth, which was one of the middle ribs measuring 8 feet and a few inches. From that point, the remaining ribs got shorter, with the 10th and final rib measuring just over 5 feet. In terms of thickness, all the ribs corresponded well to their lengths, and the middle ribs were the most curved. In some areas of the Arsacides, they are used as beams to build footbridges over small streams. As I considered these ribs, I was once again struck by the fact, which I have mentioned several times in this book, that the skeleton of the whale is not a perfect representation of its living form. The largest rib, one of the middle ones, occupied the section of the whale that was the deepest when it was alive. This particular whale must have had a maximum depth of at least 16 feet, while the corresponding rib measured just over 8 feet. This means that this rib only conveyed half of the true size of that part of the living whale. Furthermore, where I now saw only a bare spine, there had once been tons of flesh, muscle, blood, and organs wrapped around it. As for the grand fins, all I saw were a few scattered joints, and instead of the heavy, impressive flukes, there was just emptiness. How foolish and naive, I thought, for an inexperienced, timid person to try to fully understand this amazing whale by simply staring at its lifeless, thin skeleton stretched out in this serene woodland. No, the true whale can only be truly appreciated amidst the most intense dangers, only in the swirling chaos of its powerful flukes. Only on the vast, unbounded ocean can one truly grasp the living essence of the whale. Now about the spine. The best way to consider it is to stack its bones upright, like a crane would do. It's no quick task, but now that it's done, it resembles Pompey's pillar. There are over 40 vertebrae in total, and they are not locked together in the skeleton. They mostly lie like large, knobby blocks on a Gothic spire, forming solid layers of heavy masonry. The largest vertebra, which is a middle one, is about 3 feet wide and over 4 feet deep. The smallest vertebra, where the spine tapers into the tail, is only 2 inches wide and resembles a white billiard ball. I was told there were even smaller ones, but they had been lost by some little kids, the priest's children, who took them to play marbles. So we see how the spine of even the largest living creatures eventually tapers down to simple child's play. Chapter 104. The fossil whale. The whale, with its massive size, provides a perfect topic to explore and elaborate on. You couldn't even begin to condense it into a smaller form. It deserves to be discussed in grand volumes. Just think about how far it stretches from its blowhole to its tail and the sheer size of its waist. Consider the enormous twists and turns of its intestines, which are coiled up inside like huge cables stored away in the lower decks of a battleship. Since I've taken on the task of discussing this Leviathan, I need to be thoroughly comprehensive in my exploration, paying attention to even the smallest details, from its blood down to the furthest reaches of its bowels. Having already covered many of its anatomical and habitat characteristics, it's time to look at it from an archaeological and ancient perspective. If I were writing about any other creature, like an ant or a flea, such grand terminology might seem overly dramatic. But when it comes to the Leviathan, the situation changes. I feel compelled to tackle this topic with the most weighty words I can find. I should mention that whenever I needed a dictionary for these discussions, I used a large quarto edition of Johnson, which I specifically bought for this purpose, as his impressive size seemed fitting for an author like me writing about whales. People often talk about writers who swell with their subjects, even if those subjects are ordinary. What happens when I write about this Leviathan? My handwriting unintentionally grows into big letters. Give me a condor's feather to write with. Give me a crater of Vesuvius as an inkwell. Friends, hold my arms. The mere act of trying to express my thoughts about this Leviathan tires me out and makes me feel faint because I'm trying to encompass everything. All the sciences, all generations of whales, humans, and mastodons, both past and present, as well as all the empires on Earth and throughout the universe, even its outskirts. That's the effect of a grand and expansive topic. We grow to match its size. To write a significant book, you must choose a grand subject. You can't write an important and lasting volume about a flea, even though many have tried. Before I delve into the topic of fossil whales, I want to establish my credentials as a geologist by mentioning that I have worked as a stonemason and a digger of ditches, canals, wells, wine cellars, and all kinds of cisterns. Also, I'd like to remind you that while we find fossils of nearly extinct monsters in the older geological layers, the subsequent fossils in what we call the tertiary formations appear to be the connecting links, if not outright missing links, between those ancient creatures and the ones that eventually boarded the Ark. All the fossil whales found so far belong to the tertiary period, which is the last before the surface formations. Although none perfectly match any known species today, they are close enough to justify being classified as cetacean fossils. In the past 30 years, various broken fossils of ancient whales, fragments of their bones and skeletons, have been discovered at the base of the Alps in Lombardy, France, England, Scotland, and the U.S. states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. One particularly intriguing find was part of a skull that was excavated in 1779 on Rue Dauphine in Paris, a street that opens directly onto the Tuileries Palace, and bones that were uncovered while digging the Great Docks in Antwerp during Napoleon's era. Cuvier determined that these fragments belonged to a completely unknown species of leviathan. But the most astonishing cetacean discovery was the almost complete skeleton of an extinct monster found in 1842 on Judge Queequeg's plantation in Alabama. The astonished local slaves thought it belonged to a fallen angel. Doctors in Alabama declared it to be a huge reptile and named it Basilosaurus. However, when some of the bones were sent to Owen, the English anatomist, it turned out that this so-called reptile was actually a whale, albeit of an extinct species. This illustrates the point I've made repeatedly in this book, that a whale's skeleton gives little indication of the shape of its living body. Owen later renamed the creature Zeuglodon and stated in his paper to the London Geological Society that it was one of the most extraordinary creatures to have vanished from the earth. Standing among these massive leviathan skeletons, skulls, tusks, jaws, ribs, and vertebrae, all sharing some similarities with today's sea creatures, while also bearing connections to the ancient leviathans that preceded them, I feel transported back to an incredible time before time itself began, because time started with humans. Here I am engulfed in Saturn's gray chaos, catching faint, chilling glimpses of those polar eternities when massive ice formations pressed hard against what we now call the tropics, and not a single habitable inch of land could be seen along the entire 25,000-mile circumference of the Earth. During that time, the entire world belonged to the whale. As king of creation, he left his mark along what are now the Andes and the Himalayas. Who can trace a lineage like the Leviathans? Ahab's harpoon has shed blood older than that of the pharaohs. Methuselah seems like a schoolboy by comparison. I look around as if to shake hands with Shem. I am struck with horror at the pre-human, untamed existence of the whale's unspeakable terrors, which, having existed before time, must also exist long after humanity is gone. But the Leviathan has left its ancient traces not only in the geological record and in limestone and marl, where its old form remains, but also on ancient Egyptian tablets, which seem to have an almost fossil-like quality. We can find unmistakable impressions of its fin. About 50 years ago, in a chamber of the great temple of Dendera, a sculptured and painted celestial map was discovered on the granite ceiling, filled with centaurs, griffins, and dolphins, similar to the bizarre figures on modern celestial globes. Among them, old Leviathan swam just as he used to, appearing in that map centuries before Solomon was born. Another strange testament to the whale's ancient existence comes from the post-flood records of the venerable John Leo, an old traveler from Barbary. Not far from the seashore, there is a temple made with rafters and beams of whale bones. Monstrous-sized whales are often washed ashore dead. The locals believe that a secret power from God protects the temple so that no whale can pass it without dying. The truth is that on either side of the temple, there are rocks that extend 2 miles into the sea, which injure the whales when they hit them. They have kept a whale rib of incredible length as a miracle, which lies on the ground with its curved side facing up, forming an arch that can't be reached by a man on a camel. This rib, John Leo states, has been there for 100 years before I saw it. Their historians claim that a prophet who foretold the coming of Muhammad came from this temple, and some even insist that the prophet Jonah was thrown up by the whale at the base of this temple. I leave you now, reader, in this African temple of the whale, and if you are from Nantucket and a whaler, you will silently honor it there. Chapter 105. Does the whale's magnitude diminish? Will he perish? As the Leviathan comes crashing down on us from the depths of eternity, it's worth asking whether it has diminished in size over the generations compared to its ancestors. Upon closer examination, we find that today's whales are actually larger than those whose fossil remains are discovered from the Tertiary period, a geological era that predates humanity. Among the whales found from that time, the later ones are generally larger than the earlier ones. Of all the ancient whales unearthed, the largest is the one found in Alabama, which was less than 70 feet long in its skeletal form. In contrast, we've seen that a large modern whale's skeleton can measure up to 72 feet. I've heard from whalers that some sperm whales have been caught measuring nearly 100 feet long. But could it be that while modern whales are larger than those from previous geological periods, They may have actually declined in size since Adam's time. If we believe the accounts of naturalists like Pliny and others from antiquity, we would have to conclude that they have. Pliny described whales that were enormous, covering acres of space, while Aldrovandus talked about others that reached 800 feet long. Even during the time of Banks and Solander, a Danish scientist noted that certain Icelandic whales measured 120 yards, about 360 feet long. Lacepede, the French naturalist, recorded that the right whale could reach 100 meters, or 328 feet, in a work published as recently as 1825. But would any modern whaler believe these stories? No. Today's whales are just as big as those from Pliny's time. If I ever meet Pliny as a whaler, I'd confidently tell him that. I don't understand how Egyptian mummies, buried thousands of years before Pliny was born, don't take up as much space in their coffins as a modern Kentuckian does in his socks. Similarly, the animals carved on the ancient Egyptian and Assyrian tablets show that today's prize cattle exceed even the finest livestock of Pharaoh's time. So why should the whale be the only animal to have shrunk? There's another question that often comes up among the more knowledgeable whalers from Nantucket. With the almost all-seeing lookouts on whaling ships now exploring even the most remote areas, and the countless harpoons and lances thrown along all coasts, can the Leviathan really survive such widespread hunting? Will it eventually be exterminated from the oceans, with the last whale, like the last man, smoking its final pipe and disappearing in a puff of smoke? When we compare the whale population to the buffalo herds that, not even 40 years ago, roamed by the tens of thousands across the plains of Illinois and Missouri, shaking their heavy manes and glaring down at the growing cities where land is now sold by the inch, it seems like a strong argument that whales might soon face extinction too. However, we must look at this from all angles. Just a short time ago, the length of a single lifetime, the buffalo population in Illinois was greater than the current population of London. Yet today, not a single buffalo horn or hoof remains in that area. The cause of this extermination was human hunting. Yet the nature of whale hunting is quite different, preventing such an undignified end for the Leviathan. 40 men on a whaling ship may feel accomplished if they return home with the oil from 40 whales after hunting for 48 months. In contrast, in the days of the old Canadian and Native American hunters, the same number of men, riding horses instead of sailing ships, could have killed not 40 but over 40,000 buffalo in the same period, something that could be statistically proven if needed. It's also not a strong argument for the gradual extinction of the sperm whale, for instance, that they were encountered more frequently in the past. In the late 18th century, they traveled in small pods, making voyages shorter and more profitable. Nowadays, whales swim in huge groups, so the solitary ones and small groups of the past have become vast, separated herds. The fact that the so-called whalebone whales no longer frequent certain areas doesn't mean they are declining. They're just being driven from one coast to another. If they no longer appear in one place, you can be sure they've recently shown up in another. Furthermore, the whalebone whales have two strongholds that are likely to remain secure for a long time. Just as the Swiss retreated to their mountains when their valleys were invaded, these whales can escape to their polar homes, diving beneath icy barriers and rising in frigid waters where they can evade human hunters. Some philosophers on whaling ships argue that because about 50 of these whalebone whales are caught for every cachalot, this hunting is significantly reducing their numbers. Yet, even though about 13,000 of these whales have been killed each year on the northwest coast by Americans alone, this doesn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. While it's natural to be skeptical about the populations of the larger animals on Earth, what do we say to Hardo, the historian of Goa, who reported that during one hunt, the king of Siam captured 4,000 elephants? In those regions, elephants are as numerous as cattle in temperate climates. There's no reason to doubt that if elephants, hunted for thousands of years by rulers like Semiramis, Porus, and Hannibal, can still thrive, then the great whale will likely survive all hunting efforts, since its habitat is twice as vast as all of Asia, both Americas, Europe, Africa, Australia, and all the islands of the sea combined. Additionally, we should consider the whale's expected longevity. Whales can live for a century or more, meaning that at any given time, multiple adult generations are likely coexisting. We can grasp the implications of this by imagining that all the men, women, and children alive 75 years ago suddenly came back to life and were added to today's global population. For all these reasons, we consider the whale immortal in its species, even if its individual members are not. It swam the seas long before the continents emerged. It once swam over where the Tuileries, Windsor Castle, and the Kremlin now stand. During Noah's flood, it disregarded the ark. And if the world were ever to flood again, like the Netherlands, to rid itself of rats, the eternal whale would still endure, rising above the waters and spouting its frothy defiance at the heavens. Chapter 106, Ahab's Leg. The way Captain Ahab abruptly left the Samuel Enderby of London involved a bit of roughness, even hurting himself in the process. He landed so hard on a seat in his boat that his ivory leg took a jarring hit. Once he was back on his own deck and turned around to urgently command the steersman, it was always something about not steering firmly enough, the already shaken ivory took another twist and jolt. While it still looked intact and strong, Ahab didn't fully trust it anymore. And honestly, it wasn't surprising that despite his reckless behavior, Ahab sometimes paid close attention to the condition of the artificial leg he stood on. Not long before the Pequod set sail from Nantucket, he had been found one night lying on the ground, unconscious. His ivory limb had been violently knocked out of place, almost piercing his groin, and it took a lot of effort to fully heal that agonizing wound. At the time, Ahab couldn't help but think that the pain he was suffering then was a direct result of past misfortunes. He clearly saw that, just as the most poisonous snake breeds just as inevitably as the sweetest songbird, every happy event naturally leads to similar misfortunes. In fact, he believed that for every joy, there were even more sorrows to follow. Not to mention that some teachings suggest that while some pleasures might not leave any lasting happiness in the afterlife, guilty sorrows can create an endless lineage of grief, even beyond death. Ignoring that point, there still seems to be an imbalance in how we view joy and sorrow. Ahab thought that while even the greatest earthly joys often have a trivial side, all heartaches carry a mysterious significance and, in some people, a sort of angelic grandeur. The paths of these deep human sorrows eventually lead us back to the origins of the gods. Thus, despite all the bright, cheerful suns and the gentle harvest moons, we must admit that even the gods aren't always joyful. The permanent mark of sadness on humanity is just a reminder of the sorrow inherent in our existence. Here, a secret has unintentionally been revealed that might have been better discussed earlier. Many people have wondered why Ahab had secluded himself both before and after the Pequod set sail, choosing to isolate himself almost like a holy figure among the dead. Captain Peleg's suggested explanation seemed inadequate. After all, Ahab's true nature was often shrouded in more darkness than clarity. Eventually, however, the truth did come out. A terrible accident had caused his temporary retreat. Not only that, but to the small group of people on land who had the rare privilege of approaching him without being rebuffed, this incident, remaining unexplained by Ahab, was filled with fears that had some connection to the supernatural. Out of concern for him, they all agreed to keep the details of the event from others. Therefore, it was quite some time before the truth was revealed on the decks of the Pequod. Regardless, whether the unseen forces or vengeful spirits had any influence on Ahab's life or not, he took practical steps regarding his leg. He called for the carpenter. When the carpenter arrived, Ahab ordered him to start making a new leg immediately. He instructed the mates to ensure that he was supplied with all the ivory pieces from sperm whales that had been collected on the voyage so that he could carefully select the strongest, highest quality materials. After that, Ahab ordered the carpenter to finish the leg that very night and to prepare all the fittings needed, separate from those for the leg he no longer trusted. Additionally, he had the ship's forge brought out of storage, and to speed things up, he instructed the blacksmith to begin forging any iron parts that might be necessary. Chapter 107, The Carpenter. If you were to sit like a sultan among the moons of Saturn and look at a single high-minded man, he might seem remarkable, grand, and tragic. But if you broaden your view to humanity as a whole, most people look like an unnecessary crowd of similar copies, both from the present and the past. However, even though he was humble and didn't embody the lofty ideals of humanity, the carpenter on the Pequod was no copy. That's why he now takes the stage. Like all ship carpenters, especially those on whaling ships, he was, to some extent, knowledgeable in various trades related to his own. Carpentry is the foundational craft that connects many different skills involving wood. But more than that, the carpenter on the Pequod was especially skilled in handling the countless mechanical challenges that frequently arose during a long voyage to distant, uncivilized seas. Aside from his routine tasks like repairing boats, fixing broken spars, reshaping awkward oars, installing bullseyes in the deck, or adding new nails to the side planks, he was also quick to adapt to all sorts of unusual situations, whether practical or quirky. His main workspace was his vice bench, a large, sturdy table equipped with several vices of various sizes, made from both iron and wood. When whales weren't alongside, this bench was securely fastened across the back of the try-works. If a belaying pin was too big to fit into its hole, he would put it in one of his vices and file it down to size. If a rare bird landed on the ship and was caught, he would create a pagoda-like cage for it using polished rods of whalebone and sperm whale ivory. If an oarsman sprained his wrist, the carpenter would mix up a soothing lotion. Stubb wanted red stars painted on the blades of his oars, so the carpenter would screw each oar into his big wooden vise and paint the constellation. If a sailor wanted to wear earrings made of shark bone, the carpenter would drill holes in his ears. If someone had a toothache, he would bring out his pliers, telling the sailor to sit on his bench, but the poor guy would squirm under the pain, so the carpenter would spin the handle of his wooden vise, gesturing for him to put his jaw in there if he wanted the tooth removed. In this way, the carpenter was ready for anything, treating everything with a lack of concern or respect. He viewed teeth as just bits of ivory, heads as merely top blocks, and people as simple mechanisms. With all his diverse skills and lively expertise, one might think he was exceptionally intelligent, but that wasn't entirely the case. What stood out about him was a certain impersonal dullness. It was as if he blended into the surrounding world, which, despite its countless activities, remains silent and indifferent, even when you're trying to build cathedrals. Yet this somewhat eerie dullness in him also seemed to hint at a lack of compassion. At times, though, it would be broken by a dry, ancient humor, streaked with a kind of grizzled wit, like something that might have entertained the crew on Noah's Ark during the midnight watch. Was this old carpenter a lifelong wanderer whose travels had stripped away any surface-level attachments he once had? He was an abstract figure, whole and unbroken, living without any deliberate connection to this world or the next. One might say this odd lack of attachment hinted at a sort of unintelligence. In his many trades, he didn't seem to work from reason, instinct, training, or even a mix of those factors. Instead, he operated through a simple, mechanical process. He was a pure craftsman. If he ever had a brain, it must have flowed into the muscles of his hands long ago. He was like one of those simple yet highly functional pocket knives that, while it might look a bit bulky, holds not only various blades, but also screwdrivers, corkscrews, tweezers, awls, pens, rulers, and nail files. So, if his superiors needed him to act as a screwdriver, they just had to open that part of him, and the screw would be fastened. Or if they needed tweezers, they could just pick him up by the legs, and there they were. However, as previously mentioned, this versatile carpenter was no mere machine or automaton. Even if he lacked a common soul, he had some subtle essence that performed its duty. What that was, whether it was quicksilver or some other mystery, remains unknown, but it existed and had persisted for over 60 years. This inexplicable life force within him was what led him to soliloquize often. Though not like a person thinking deeply, it was more like a wheel that hums while turning. His body acted like a sentry box, with this inner voice keeping watch and talking to itself to stay awake. Chapter 108. Ahab and the Carpenter. The carpenter stands at his vice bench, working under the light of 2 lanterns, busily filing the ivory piece for the leg, which is securely held in the vise. Around the bench, there are slabs of ivory, leather straps, pads, screws, and various tools scattered about. In the foreground, the red flame of the forge is visible where the blacksmith is working. Darn this file and darn this bone. This part is hard when it should be soft, and this part is soft when it should be hard. That's the life of us who work on old jaws and shin bones. Let's try another one. Now this is working better. Wow, this bone dust is goodness. Bless my soul, it's making it hard to speak. This is what an old man gets for working with dead wood. If you cut a live tree, you don't get this dust. If you remove a live bone, you don't get this. Come on, you old smut, lend a hand, and let's get that ferrule and buckle screw. I'll be ready for them shortly. Luckily, there's no knee joint to make. That could be tricky, but a simple shin bone, why? That's as easy as making hop poles. I just want to put a nice finish on it. Time. If I only had the time, I could make him a nice leg, as polished as any one you'd see in a parlor. Those buckskin legs and calves I've seen in shop windows wouldn't even compare. They soak up water, and of course get rheumatic and need lotions and washes, just like real legs. There, before I saw it off, I need to call His Majesty and check if the length is right. I suspect it might be too short. Ha! That's the heel. We're in luck. Here he comes, or it must be someone else, that's for sure. Ahab enters. Ahab said, "Well, manmaker." Carpenter said, "Just in time, sir. If the captain will allow, I will now mark the length." "Let me measure, sir." Ahab said, "Measured for a leg." "Good. Well, it's not the first time. Let's get to it. Keep your finger on it. This is quite a sturdy vise you have here, Carpenter. Let me feel its grip." So, it does pinch a bit. Carpenter said, "Oh, sir, it could break bones. Beware." Ahab said, "No fear. I like a good grip. I like to feel something in this slippery world that can hold. What's Prometheus doing over there? The blacksmith, I mean. What's he up to?" Carpenter said, "He must be forging the buckle screw, sir." "Right. It's a partnership. He provides the muscle. He's creating a fierce red flame over there." "Yes, sir. He needs it to work on this fine detail." It seems meaningful that old Greek Prometheus, who supposedly created man, was a blacksmith and brought them to life with fire, because what's made in fire truly belongs to fire, and that makes hell probable. Look at how the soot flies. This must be what the Greek made the Africans from. Carpenter, when he's done with that buckle, tell him to forge a pair of steel shoulder blades. There's a peddler aboard with a heavy pack. Carpenter said, "Sir?" Ahab said, "Hold on. While Prometheus is at it, I'll order a complete man after a desirable pattern. First, 50 feet tall in his socks, then a chest modeled after the Thames Tunnel, then legs with roots to stay in one place, arms 3 feet thick at the wrist, no heart at all, a brass forehead, and about 1/4 of an acre of fine brains. And let me see, should I order eyes that see outward? No, let's put a skylight on top of his head to illuminate inward. There, take the order and go." Carpenter said, "Now, what's he talking about? And who is he talking to? Should I keep standing here?" "It's pretty poor design to make a blind dome. Here's one." No. I must have a lantern." Ahab said, Ho, that's it, isn't it? "Here are 2, sir. One will do for me." Carpenter said, "What are you shoving that light into my face for, man? Shoving light is worse than pointing a gun at someone." Ahab said, "I thought, sir, that you were talking to the carpenter." Said Carpenter, "Why? But no. It's a very tidy, and I may say a rather gentlemanly sort of job you have here, Carpenter. Or would you rather work in clay?" Carpenter said, "Sir, clay? That's mud. We leave clay to ditch diggers, sir." Ahab said, "The guy's blasphemous. Why are you sneezing?" "The bone is a bit dusty, sir." "Take the hint, then. When you're dead, don't bury yourself under the noses of living people." "Sir? I guess so, yes. Oh dear. Look, Carpenter, I'd wager you consider yourself a pretty good workman, right? Well, it should reflect well on your work if, when I go to put this leg you're making on, I don't feel another leg in exactly the same spot. That is, Carpenter, my old lost leg, the flesh and blood one, I mean. Can't you drive that old Adam away?" Carpenter said, "Sir, I'm starting to understand a bit now. Yes, I've heard something curious about that, how a man without a mast never completely loses the feeling of his old spar, but it still pricks him at times. May I ask if that's really true, sir?" Ahab said, "It is, man. Look, put your living leg in the spot where mine once was. So now there is only one distinct leg to the eye, yet two to the soul. Where you feel tingling life, there, exactly there, to the hair, do I. Is it a riddle? Carpenter said, I'd humbly call it a tough question, sir. Ahab said, then listen. How do you know that some entire living thinking thing may not be standing invisibly and unnoticeably right where you are? Yes, and standing there in spite of you. In your most solitary moments, don't you fear eavesdroppers? Hold on, don't speak. And if I still feel the pain of my crushed leg, even though it's long gone, then why can't you, Carpenter, feel the fiery pains of hell forever, even without a body? Ha! Carpenter said, Good Lord. Truly, sir, if it comes to that, I need to recalculate. I think I underestimated a little, sir. Ahab said, Look, pudding heads should never make assumptions. How long before the leg is done? Carp said, Perhaps an hour, sir. Then keep at it and bring it to me. Oh, life! Here I am, as proud as a Greek god, yet I owe this blockhead for a bone to stand on. Cursed be that mortal debt that keeps ledgers. I want to be free as air, yet I'm down in the world's records. I'm so rich, I could have outbid the wealthiest Romans at the auction of the Roman Empire, which was the world's. And yet I owe for the flesh in the tongue I brag with. By heavens, I'll get a crucible and dissolve myself down to one small, compact vertebra. There. Carpenter, resuming his work, said, Well, well, well. Stubb knows him best, and Stubb always says he's odd. He says nothing but that one little word, odd. He's odd, says Stubb. He's odd. Odd, odd, and keeps telling Mr. Starbuck all the time, odd, sir, odd, very odd. And here's his leg. Yes, now that I think of it, here's his partner. He has a stick of whale jawbone for a wife, and this is his leg. He'll stand on this. What was that now about one leg standing in three places, and all three places standing in one hell? How did that go? Oh, I don't blame him for looking so scornfully at me. I'm a bit strange-minded sometimes, they say, but that's just by chance. A short little old body like mine should never try to wade into deep waters with tall, heron-like captains. The water can quickly get under your chin, and then it's a big call for lifeboats. And here's the heron's leg. Long and slim, sure enough. For most people, one pair of legs lasts a lifetime, and that must be because they use them gently, like a kind-hearted old lady uses her tired old coach horses. But Ahab, oh, he's a hard driver. Look, he's worn one leg to death and ruined the other for life, and now he's using bone legs like a machine. Hey, you smut! Lend a hand with those screws, and let's finish this before the resurrection guy comes calling with his horn for all legs, true or false, like brewery men collecting old beer barrels to fill them up again. What a leg this is. It looks like a real live leg, filed down to nothing but the core. He'll be standing on this tomorrow. He'll be taking measurements on it. Oh, I almost forgot the little oval slate, smooth ivory, where he calculates the latitude. So, chisel, file, and sandpaper now. Chapter 109. Ahab and Starbuck in the cabin. The next morning, they were pumping out the ship, and to their surprise, a significant amount of oil came up with the water. The barrels below must have developed a serious leak, causing quite a bit of concern. Starbuck went down to the cabin to report this troubling news. In whaling ships carrying a substantial amount of oil, it's standard practice to run a hose into the hold and soak the barrels with seawater. This water is later pumped out at various intervals. This process helps keep the barrels damp and sealed, and the changing appearance of the extracted water allows the crew to detect any serious leaks in the valuable cargo. At that time, the Pequod was nearing Formosa and the Bashi Islands, which lie between the tropical waters of China and the Pacific Ocean. Starbuck found Ahab studying a general map of the eastern archipelagos, along with a separate map showing the long eastern coastlines of the Japanese islands, Niphon, Matsumae, and Sukoke. With his new ivory leg propped against the table and a long jackknife in hand, the remarkable old man had his back to the door and was deep in thought, tracing his old roots. "Who's there?" he called out upon hearing footsteps at the door, without turning. "Get on deck. Leave." "Captain Ahab, it's me," Starbuck replied. "The oil in the hold is leaking, sir. We need to bring up the Burtons and break out the casks." "Bring up the Burtons and break out? Now that we're getting close to Japan? Stay here for a week to fix a bunch of old hoops?" "Either do that, sir, or we'll waste more oil in one day than we could collect in a year." What we traveled 20,000 miles for is worth saving, sir. True enough, but only if we manage to get it. I was talking about the oil in the hold, sir. And I wasn't talking or thinking about that at all. Get out. Let it leak. I'm leaking too. Leaks everywhere. Not only are the barrels leaking, but they're in a leaky ship, which is a much worse situation than the Pequod's. Yet I won't stop to fix my leak because how can you even find it in this heavy-loaded hull? And how could you hope to fix it in this howling gale of life? Starbuck, I won't have the Burtons hoisted. What will the owners say, sir? Let the owners stand on Nantucket Beach and shout louder than the typhoons. What do I care about the owners? You always go on about those miserly owners as if they were my conscience. But listen, the only real owner of anything is its captain, and my conscience is in this ship's keel. Get on deck. Captain Ahab, said the now red-faced mate, stepping further into the cabin with a cautiousness that seemed to avoid any display of assertiveness and appeared almost half distrustful of himself. A better man than I could overlook in you what he would quickly resent in a younger man, yes, and even in a happier Captain Ahab. Devils, do you dare to critically think about me? Get on deck. No, sir, not yet, I beg you. I do dare, sir, to be patient. Can we not understand each other better than we have so far, Captain Ahab? Ahab grabbed a loaded musket from the rack, which was a common piece of furniture in South Sea men's cabins, and pointed it at Starbuck, exclaiming, "There's one God who is Lord over the earth, and one captain who is Lord over the Pequod. Get on deck." For a moment, you would have almost thought that the flash in the mate's eyes and his flushed cheeks indicated he had actually felt the threat of the leveled weapon. But regaining his composure, he stood up calmly, and as he left the cabin, paused to say, "You've outraged me, sir, not insulted me, but I ask you not to be wary of Starbuck. You would only laugh. Instead, let Ahab beware of Ahab. Beware of yourself, old man. He grows bold, but still obeys. What careful bravery," murmured Ahab as Starbuck disappeared. "What was that he said? Ahab, beware of Ahab. There's something to that." Then, unconsciously using the musket as a staff, he began pacing back and forth in the small cabin. But soon, the furrows in his brow relaxed, and after returning the musket to the rack, he went up on deck. "You're a good man, Starbuck," he said quietly to the mate, then raising his voice to the crew. "Furl the top-gallant sails and close-reef the topsails, fore and aft, back the main yard, hoist the Burtons, and break out the main hold." It might be pointless to guess why Ahab acted this way toward Starbuck. It could have been a flash of honesty or simply practical policy that required him to avoid any hint of open discontent, even temporarily, from the important chief officer of his ship. Whatever the reason, his orders were carried out, and the Burtons were hoisted. Chapter 110. Queequeg in his coffin. After searching, they discovered that the last barrels brought into the hold were completely intact, meaning the leak must be coming from somewhere else. With calm weather, they dug deeper and deeper, disturbing the slumbering, massive lower barrels, bringing these huge containers into the daylight above. They went so deep that the oldest, most corroded barrels looked like they might be hiding some ancient treasure or coins from Captain Noah, along with old warnings about the flood. They hoisted out tier after tier of water, bread, beef, and piles of staves and iron hoops, until the decks were piled so high that it was hard to move around. The hollow hull echoed underfoot, sounding like walking over empty catacombs, and the ship rolled in the sea like a giant bottle. It felt as top-heavy as a starving student trying to carry all of Aristotle's works in his head. It was fortunate that they weren't visited by any typhoons at that moment. During this time, my dear friend Queequeg fell ill with a fever that brought him close to death. It's worth mentioning that in the whaling profession, there are no easy jobs. Dignity and danger go hand in hand. Until you become captain, the higher you rise, the harder you work. Poor Queequeg, as the harpooner, had to face the fury of the living whale and, as we've seen before, climb onto its dead body in a rough sea. Then he had to descend into the darkness of the hold and sweat all day in that cramped space, wrestling with clumsy barrels and ensuring they were stowed properly. To put it simply, among whalers, the harpooneers are known as the holders. Poor Queequeg. When the ship was about half emptied, if you had leaned over the hatchway and looked down, you would have seen him there, stripped to his woolen drawers, crawling around in the damp and slime like a green-spotted lizard at the bottom of a well. And to him, it proved to be either a well or an ice house. Strangely, despite all his sweating, he caught a terrible chill that turned into a fever. After suffering for several days, he ended up in his hammock, close to death's door. He wasted away over those long, lingering days until it seemed like there was little left of him except his body and tattoos. But while everything else thinned, his cheekbones became more prominent, and his eyes appeared fuller and fuller. They had a strange softness, shining with a mild yet profound look that seemed to testify to an immortal spirit within him that couldn't die or weaken. Like ripples on water that expand as they fade, his eyes seemed to round out, resembling the rings of eternity. An indescribable awe washed over you as you sat by this fading savage, seeing in his face the same strange things that bystanders might have seen when Zoroaster died. Whatever is truly wondrous and terrifying in humanity has never been captured in words or books. And as death approaches, it levels all things, imparting a final revelation that only someone who has died could properly express. So let's say it again. No dying Chaldean or Greek had more profound or sacred thoughts than those mysterious shadows creeping over Queequeg's face as he lay quietly in his swaying hammock, rocked by the rolling sea towards his final rest, while the invisible tides of the ocean lifted him higher and higher toward his destined heaven. Not a single crew member held out hope for him, and as for Queequeg himself, his thoughts about his situation were made clear by a curious request he made. He called to one of the crew during the gray morning watch, when day was just breaking, took his hand, and explained that while in Nantucket, he had seen certain little canoes made of dark wood, similar to the rich war wood from his homeland. He learned that all whalemen who died in Nantucket were laid in those same dark canoes, and he found the idea pleasing. It reminded him of his own culture, where they would embalm a dead warrior, lay him out in his canoe, and send him floating away to the starry islands. They believed that the stars were islands, and beyond all visible horizons, their own peaceful seas merged with the blue heavens, forming the white breakers of the Milky Way. He added that the thought of being buried in his hammock, tossed like something vile to the death-devouring sharks, horrified him. No, he wanted a canoe like those in Nantucket, which suited him as a whaleman, since, like a whaleboat, these coffin canoes had no keel, though that made for uncertain steering and a lot of drifting down the dim ages. When this strange wish became known, the carpenter was immediately instructed to fulfill Queequeg's request, whatever it entailed. There was some old, coffin-colored lumber on board, cut from the ancient forests of the Lackaday Islands during a previous voyage, and it was recommended that the coffin be made from those dark planks. As soon as the carpenter was informed of the order, he took his measuring tools and went to the forecastle, where he accurately measured Queequeg, carefully chalking his body as he moved the measuring stick. "Ah, poor fellow! He'll have to die now," exclaimed the Long Island sailor. Going to his workbench, the carpenter measured the length of the coffin for convenience and reference, making it permanent by cutting 2 notches at each end. Once this was done, he gathered the planks and tools and got to work. When the last nail was hammered in and the lid was planed and fitted, he shouldered the coffin and went forward, asking if they were ready for it in that direction. Overhearing the annoyed yet half-humorous cries from the crew on deck as they tried to move the coffin, Queequeg, to everyone's shock, ordered that the coffin be brought to him immediately, and no one could deny him. After all, some dying men can be the most demanding, and since they will trouble us so little forever, these poor souls should be indulged. Leaning over in his hammock, Queequeg gazed at the coffin with intense interest. Then he asked for his harpoon, had the wooden handle removed, and placed the iron head in the coffin along with one of his paddles. By his request, biscuits were arranged around the sides inside. A flask of fresh water was placed at the head, and a small bag of dirt scraped up from the hold was put at the foot. He rolled up a piece of sailcloth for a pillow and then requested to be lifted into his final resting place to test its comfort, if it had any. He lay still for a few minutes, then asked someone to go to his bag and bring out his little god, Yojo. Crossing his arms over his chest with Yojo in between, he asked for the coffin lid, which he referred to as a hatch, to be placed over him. The head of the coffin swung shut with a leather hinge, and there lay Queequeg with only his peaceful face visible. "Rarmai, it's fine, it's comfortable," he murmured at last, signaling to be put back in his hammock. But before that could happen, Pip, who had been secretly lingering nearby, approached him where he lay, and sobbing softly, took his hand while holding his tambourine in the other. "Poor wanderer, will you never be done with this weary wandering? Where are you going now? But if the currents carry you to those sweet Antilles where the beaches are only brushed by water lilies, will you do me a little favor? Find Pip, who has been missing for a long time. I think he's in those far Antilles. If you find him, comfort him. He must be very sad. Look, he left his tambourine behind. I found it. Rig-a-dig, dig, dig. Now, Queequeg, die, and I'll play your dying march." "I've heard," murmured Starbuck, gazing down the scuttle, "that during intense fevers, people, completely unaware, have spoken in ancient languages. And when you look into it, it always turns out that these ancient languages were actually spoken to them in their childhood by some learned scholars. So, in my hopeful belief, poor Pip, in the odd sweetness of his madness, brings heavenly reminders of all our heavenly homes. Where did he learn that, except there? Listen, he speaks again, but now it's even wilder. Form 2 by 2. Let's make him a general. Hey, where's his harpoon? Lay it across here. Rig-a-dig, dig, dig. Hooray! Oh, how I wish for a gamecock to sit on his head and crow. Queequeg dies bravely. Remember that. Queequeg dies bravely. Take note of it. Queequeg dies bravely. I say, brave, brave, brave. But that cowardly little Pip, he died shaking, out with Pip. Listen, if you find Pip, tell everyone in the Antilles he's a runaway. A coward, a coward, a coward. Tell them he jumped out of a whaleboat. I would never beat my tambourine for cowardly Pip and call him general if he were dying right here again. No way. Shame on all cowards. Shame on them. Let them drown like Pip, who jumped out of a whaleboat. Shame! Shame! Through all this, Queequeg lay with his eyes closed, as if he were dreaming. Pip was led away, and the sick man was placed back in his hammock. But now that Queequeg had seemingly made every preparation for death, now that his coffin fit him well, he suddenly rallied. Soon it seemed like there was no need for the carpenter's box. When some expressed their surprise, he explained that the reason for his sudden recovery was that he had just recalled a little duty back on shore that he hadn't completed, and that made him change his mind about dying. He insisted he couldn't die just yet. They asked him if whether to live or die was entirely up to him. He replied, "Of course." In short, Queequeg believed that if a man decided to live, mere sickness couldn't kill him. Only a whale, a storm, or some other uncontrollable, mindless force could. Now, there's an interesting difference between savages and civilized people. While a sick civilized man may take 6 months to recover, a sick savage can often bounce back to almost full health in just a day. So in time, my Queequeg regained his strength, and after sitting on the windlass for a few lazy days, but eating heartily, he suddenly jumped to his feet, stretched out his arms and legs, yawned a little, then sprang to the bow of his hoisted boat, picked up a harpoon, and declared himself ready for a fight. With a whimsical spirit, he began using his coffin as a sea chest. He emptied his canvas bag of clothes into it and organized them. He spent many spare hours carving the lid with all sorts of strange figures and drawings, seemingly trying to recreate parts of the intricate tattoos on his body. These tattoos had been created by a departed prophet and seer from his island, who had used those hieroglyphic marks to inscribe a complete theory of the heavens and the earth and a mystical guide to finding truth on his body. So Queequeg, in a way, was a riddle to be unraveled. A remarkable work in one volume, whose mysteries even he could not read, though his own heart beat against them. Ultimately, these mysteries were destined to decay along with the living skin they were drawn upon, remaining unsolved forever. This thought must have inspired Ahab's wild exclamation one morning as he turned away from watching poor Queequeg. "Oh, the devilish teasing of the gods!